everybody. Thank you guys so much for sticking around for some of the final sessions for today at the Borderless Summit. I am extremely excited about this next panel because I was actually fortunate enough to be the first person to ever get to write about this company. Baiju Bhatt started something that at first was really just an idea, but has turned into a way to democratize the entire financial system. And really, it's done something very incredible, which is it's taken something that seemed really boring to millennials, like stock trading and options, and turned it into something fun and cool, something that you actually are seeing really hit billboards for and little bus stop ads all around San Francisco. Things like, I really like buy low, stay high. That's a great one for your stock trading app. And so I'd like you guys to please invite up our wonderful guest, Baiju Bhatt from Robinhood. So we first talked about Robinhood about 6 years ago at my kitchen table, and at that time it was not even a trading platform. It was an idea for a social, mobile stock news source where basically you could find out what other people were trading and what their recommendations were. It was like Kramer's Mad Money, but kind of mobile. But you ended up refining that idea into something that has become an outrageously big business. They just raised it at a $5.6 billion valuation. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you went from this sort of crackpot idea and refined it into something that really became such an outstanding business. And give our founders an idea of like, how can they refine their ideas into something a little bit more, more successful?
Absolutely. I do remember that conversation, and at the time, this was back in 2013, when we spoke, we had the idea for making the stock market. We'd seen the state of affairs with trading on the stock market, and we saw that there was this $10 commission, which was ubiquitous. Like anywhere you went, it cost about $10 to trade. And having worked previously in finance, Vlad, who was my co-founder, and I had kind of asked the question of why does this cost so much, and we basically figured out that that was an artifact of the days gone by before markets had become electronic, and we're like, we're pretty sure we can make this free.
And so like that money was literally paying like dudes to stand on the stock like exchange and scream.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you take a look at it from that standpoint, like maybe that should cost something because you have to pay those dudes to scream, and like they need to get paid to scream. But like the era of screaming on the floor had actually gone away way before that, and so it was just that business model without any screaming, just like sloshing into the brokerages. And so we had this idea for making this free. But in order to do that, we would have to get registered as a broker-dealer and actually become a regulated financial institution. And it turns out that that's hard. And it takes a really long time to do. And as we were working on that idea, and we had filed the paper with the regulators and were building that, we wanted to start building a mobile app, which we thought eventually was going to be the future of that. And so while that application was going in the background, we launched Robinhood, which was actually, which you actually covered, were the first one to cover, which let you read financial news, build watch lists of stocks, and you could rate stocks, like if you thought they were going to go up or down. Turns out that was a terrible idea. It was just the worst idea.
It's like, the only person I think that might be worse at picking stocks than me is like my best friend. So listening to them is not necessarily the best way to make money on the stock market.
Yeah, I mean, that was a part of it. The other part was that it was just not something people actually wanted to do. Like if you cared about the stock market enough to pick a stock, you probably were buying the thing. And so what we found was that product was way too complicated. By the time we got our brokerage license and we're like, okay, we can actually offer this free stock trading service, we'd kind of seen the usage of that other product sort of dwindle and dwindle and dwindle and dwindle. And when we were actually going to send the sunset email that we were sunsetting the product, we looked at our dashboards and we're like, there's only 30 active users this month. Like, do we need to send this email?
You just go tell them in person, like, hey, sorry, I'm shutting down my app.
Yeah, they just pulled the plug on the servers. But yeah, it was interesting. I don't know that we would have landed at the product that we did, which is really simple, really bare bones, and just about you and your money, if we hadn't gone through that process of making what was, I think, a pretty big mistake of just stuffing a bunch of functionality into the app that preceded them.
That's a pretty cool insight, because I think a lot of people, they assume like, oh, if I'm going to build a new product, I want it to do lots of useful things. Like, that seems intuitive, but really what ends up happening is you're kind of good at a bunch of things, but there's always somebody better than you. And in the modern age, especially on mobile, it's like you can switch between apps so easily that you can pick the best in class for everything. And instead, if you build something that has a narrow functionality that people really love using, you end up building the kind of momentum and word of mouth that leads to the growth. And then once you have enough users, you can say like, oh, we've got something else we can offer you too. And there's already a mental model of like, this is why I opened the Robinhood app, but now there's extra cool things I can do as well. Whereas before, I see a lot of startups who do so many things, it's like, you don't even remember when you should pull out the app. And so like, maybe you could talk about like that moat though that you guys generated, which is that a lot of times people shy away from regulated industries because they assume like, I don't know what I'm doing, it's going to take all this time. But I don't think what they realize is that that's all this time that you have a head start on everybody else if this actually works. And now, years later, we still don't really see anything like Robinhood that exists. There's like a few things that are like, we have low fees, but there's still nothing that really works just like it. So maybe like you could tell us a little bit about the grit that was required to go through that process, but also, yeah, we were just talking about that process of being like, yeah, we're gonna wade into this awful regulation and bureaucracy.
Yeah, flavors of that are certainly true. I think when we were getting started, we were some combination of timid about the regulations, or just flat out worried, or like thought it was very cumbersome. And when we actually became a regulated business, when we finally went through the process of getting the regulators to say, okay, you have the systems and procedures, the oversight, the personnel to actually manage people's money and be stewards of the capital system, our opinion on it completely changed. And we realized that one, this was the regulations that we were held to were one, things that we should be doing anyways. Two, things that exist largely to protect the financial system and protect consumers. And three, like, it's a set of rules to adhere to, which, you know, we felt comfortable doing anyways. And over the years, we've actually, you know, gone from being the startup version of that to being like, yeah, we welcome regulation. We think it's categorically better. We think from time to time it's a little bit cumbersome, but that's not really a bad thing. And I think that a lot of startups will view places where there aren't regulation as an opportunity, and I think that's just wrong. Regulation or the lack thereof should never be an opportunity. It should be a standard that you should hold yourself to anyways, and it exists. If you kind of don't know what you're doing, it's like a ramp up to it.
So now you guys offer this zero-fee stock trading app. You recently launched cryptocurrency trading. But what that really means is when you're raising all this money, how much you guys have raised to date, just to give everyone some sticker shock?
I think about $500 million.
$500 million for a guy wearing really awesome socks.
Thanks.
So what that really means is that you have to keep that culture of your socks in the company as you grow and become not just, you know, a small scrappy startup, but like an institution. So how have you done that? Because founders often spend the most of their time on hiring compared to any other process, even their product. And so how have you managed to keep the culture of Robinhood the same, or, you know, or even better than when you and Vlad first started it, as you know, ramp up and hire hundreds of people?
Yeah, I think it's a constant culture improvement mentality, right? And it comes from a few things. Like, here's kind of the real nuts and bolts of it. People will join startups because they want challenges. They want to feel like they have the opportunity to have an outsized impact. They want to do cool stuff, and they want to build products that lots of people use. And as simple as it sounds, that's kind of the thing that we focus on. We try to have our company focused almost exclusively on building products and shipping them and servicing them. We have these moments, usually once a year, sometimes twice a year, where the whole company comes together to work on one thing. And crypto is an example of this. And it's really hard. It's a lot of fun, and it gives people a chance to kind of push their own skill sets to get out of their comfort zone and say, I don't necessarily know how to do this thing that we need to do. there really isn't anyone that knows exactly how to do this thing. Why don't we sort of keep our best intentions, think critically, and just drive towards doing it, and we'll be the ones that pave the way to do it the right way. And I think when you give people those genuine opportunities to up-level their own skills, you're kind of doing the thing that people join the startup do in the first place, and the culture builds from that.
Right, I mean, everybody in Silicon Valley, the average time people spend at a job is like 18 months. Sometimes that even seems like that's long at this point. I'm like the weirdest person in Silicon Valley because I've been at TechCrunch for 6.5 years and I don't own the company. But I think that what you're saying is they really want is to keep being challenged. And a lot of times people leave companies because they stop feeling challenged.
Absolutely.
But like if you keep making them feel like they are learning as they're going, that they have some cool milestones to attain, they're going to stick around, and that actually really reduces your hiring costs, improves the quality of your team, I think, long term, and keeps those great people on board.
Absolutely. I mean, so many of our early people are still there. I think we were talking about this earlier today. I think of our first 25 people, like maybe 20 of them are still there. The first, I don't know, 75 people, there's probably like 60. There's a lot of people.
And that's like 5 years later. That's really astounding. And I think that really tells to you guys building something that people want to be a part of. And I love, I think you guys said we started that all the way down to the brand, taking money from the rich, giving it to the poor, this idea of democratizing the fintech system for millennials and for younger people who've historically been cut out because, if you're only investing $100, that $10 trading fee is basically all of your potential to make profit.
It's a big deal, yeah.
You're starting like your stock immediately went down 10%. And so I think when you open that up and you get rid of those fees, suddenly a much wider swath of people can participate. So you talked about doing that project around crypto, bringing the whole company together. Maybe you can just walk us through that idea, because I think so many companies, when they're faced with that moment, they hesitate. And they're worried about changing their identity, about losing their existing users, about stumbling into biting off too much more than they can chew. So how did you go about getting this whole company to go from, hey, we do the most traditional financial thing to we do the most frontier pioneering financial thing?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think it's a couple of things. And the real honest answer is that it was, for Vlad and I, just very obvious that this was the thing that we had to do. Crypto had been a space that we've been looking at for a couple of years at that point. We've been working in financial technology for years and years before.
They actually built several startups that failed first. So if you think your startup's not going well, that doesn't mean you're done with startups. Yeah. This could be your next thing could be the $5 billion company.
Yeah, we had two failures before. It was quite frustrating. And so we've been thinking about crypto for a long time and had been watching it a little bit from the sidelines and had wrestled with the problem that we'd seen it kind of have this explosion of interest and it kind of died down. And we told ourselves if this happens again, this is likely something that's going to be around for a while. And when we saw it happening a second time, we saw the characteristic that we needed to have real conviction about it, which is the resiliency. Cryptocurrencies have been around for about a decade now, and they keep being relevant to society, they keep coming back. And so it was that coupled with the fact that we saw that there were not a lot of really great options for consumers, and the fees were really high. And we knew that if we were to enter the space, we would approach it with the same mindset that we had, which is to democratize access. And we made a commitment that we said, can we do this for free? And it was it's going to be challenging, but if we do it, we think that that's the way we can make this space a lot better. And so we said, we need to do this right now, and let's do it. And we did it.
How did you get the team, though, rallied around that idea of hey, I know you've been working on this very traditional thing. Now we're going to do this crazy thing that could blow up in a year and not be a thing at all, but we think it's important enough to take that risk.
I think we just leveled with people. We were pretty honest. We acknowledged all of those risks existed, but we realized that if we don't act on our instincts when we think something is really important, Vlad and I, as founders and leaders of our company, are failing. And we had a pretty honest discussion with the whole organization, and we're okay, starting later on today, we're going to cut all the other projects that are going on, and everybody's going to work on this. And that day felt pretty uncomfortable, felt pretty uneasy, as like, did we just make a big mistake? A day or two later, we realized that there was a decent chance that it wasn't going to work, but it was so much damn fun, and it felt like being a 10-person startup again. And we're like, even if this doesn't work, this is just an awesome thing for our organization to be doing.
It's the whole reason you get into it sometimes, is you got to gamble. Like, if you wanted to build a safe, steady business, there's a lot of other industries you could go into.
Yeah.
So speaking of that leadership and trying to rally the troops, you guys have a very strange structure. Something that basically nobody would recommend, which is that you have 2 co-CEOs. How the hell do you make that work without just like every decision taking twice as long to make, without everything getting second guessed? You know, how do you guys make that work? Because I think a lot of companies out there are wondering, how do we manage this? Who should be the CEO? How do we handle that? But I think you guys have managed to do it in a very successful way, despite all of the traditional thinking being like, this is a terrible idea.
Yeah, conventional wisdom is that this is a terrible idea. And the reason I think it's worked is because behind the company, there's a fantastic friendship that Vlad and I have. So Vlad, who is my co-founder, the 2 of us were friends at Stanford. We met, I think around the same time I met you actually. We were both studying physics, which you can attest to. The people that study physics at Stanford are
masochists, mostly, like people who really hate their own time.
Yeah, it's a particularly nerdy bunch. And so we were both studying physics, and we were both, of even the physics majors, those like ones that are masochistic enough to like stay during the summer and study physics. You remember that program, right? The Stanford Summer Research Institute. And so we were both in this, and we met in the summer of 2005, I think, and we became friends because we'd crossed each other in the hallways in the physics department, and we both had some variation of this haircut, and I was like, that guy looks kind of cool, and I think we both fancied ourselves as kind of the cool kids. And when we became friends, we realized that, one, we were both only kids, only children. We both grew up in Virginia. And we're both children of immigrants. Vlad actually was, I think, 3 or 4 when he moved to the U.S. My parents moved to the U.S. And I was born like a month later. And we had this incredibly parallel life journey that had kind of ended us up in the same place. And we became the best of friends. We were like brothers from when we met because we didn't have any siblings. And we had this awesome chemistry where we loved hanging out together because we loved learning stuff together, and we were always really good at like teaching each other new things. And that's the kind of thing that like you can't fake it, and it's so much more important than anything else. And so, you know, a decade later and 3 startups in, we're best friends. We have a really fluid dynamic between the 2 of us, which is code for we disagree a lot. We both are very well aware of each other's strengths and weaknesses, and we have a nice dynamic where when we know the other person is passionate about something, we just get out of the way. And we trust the other person to go and run with something. And we also have a really good dynamic of whenever we're making really important decisions, we don't make them by ourselves. We also have our desks seated right next to each other.
Adorable.
And have for the last, like, I don't know, 10 years.
I think that's a cool insight. That's like being people that like want to teach each other, that you want to learn, you want to love learning with, is such an important factor to have in a co-founder, because you're going to have to pivot. I mean, the companies that were powerful 5 years ago, it's rare that they're doing the exact same thing if they're still successful. The ones that are doing the exact same thing are probably failing.
Stagnating.
Exactly.
Yeah.
At the very least, they're stagnating. And so it's like, if you're going to be able to adapt to the rapidly changing world, you can't just be like, oh, we're both really good at physics, this is going to work out great, let's build a physics startup. You have to be learners together and be willing to do that. So I wanted to talk about the toughest moment. you know, a lot of startups, it's all about like hashtag crushing it. Like, check out my TechCrunch article about how much money I raised. And then all of a sudden, it's just like, wait, then they like vaporized, they ran out of money, or they got bought for like a quarter of what they raised. Like, what happened? You don't really hear a lot about that like interim. And a lot of times, it's those moments where you either decide to give up, or you decide to say like I don't want to tie my self-worth to this thing anymore, so I'm gonna like step back a little bit. That way I can like be like, if this fails, it doesn't mean I'm a failure. There's like this separation that happens, and there's a lot of, or people just like totally quietly like stiff upper lip it and like go insane, which I definitely see frequently in startups. And what ends up happening is like 2 years later, they're like, I can't do this anymore, I'm like freaking out, I can't make the decisions that need to happen to make that next big product pivot or leap or to raise that next round, and they just like ditch out and they go. And so I'm fascinated about how you guys, through either the original startups you had that failed, or maybe the toughest times through competition or needing to pivot, how did you get through those toughest moments? I mean, what was one of those you could just tell us the story of?
I will, but before I do, I've got to say that the idea of stiff upper lipping it is an expression I've never heard, and it sounds hilarious.
Yeah, you know, it's like the British, I'm half British, and that's like the way you deal with all your problems there, is you just like shut up and bear it, which is like the worst, unless you're like in a trench in like warfare. That's not actually a very good strategy, especially in the modern age when there's like so much access to health and there's so much connection. You just like, no, it's like your brain is mean to you, your friends love you, everyone thinks you're doing a pretty decent job, but like your brain is just telling you you suck. And that's like kind of the story of startups, is it's not about like your absolute value, you just judge yourself on like how you are and your momentum compared to yesterday. So it doesn't matter if you have like 2 months straight of kicking ass, if then like one thing goes wrong, you're like, oh man, I'm a wreck, like I'm a failure. So maybe you can just tell us a little bit about how you did get through those moments, or one of those moments.
I might have stiff upper lipped a few moments.
But you have a co-CEO, so at least you're like stiff upper lipping it together.
Yeah, exactly.
Which sounds kind of strange.
Sounds very strange. Yeah, I mean, it hasn't been easy, I'll tell you that for sure. And it continues to, every stage along the way is like progressively, it's different and it's like equally hard. I would say one of the low points was that summer after we announced Robinhood, which was the stock trading, or the stock news and rating app, which was failing, and we knew it wasn't going to work. At the same time, we were working on this broker-dealer license, which takes about a year to do, which if you think about that, is kind of nuts. Because our startup story was that we waited a year where we couldn't talk to anyone about what our product was, because if we did, we were basically acting as a financial institution, which we were never going to get the regulators to greenlight what we were doing. I don't think I even told you that we were working on free trading at the time.
Because we're like, oh, well, exploring some legal stuff, but like, yeah, you wouldn't even really tell me about it.
Yeah. And we were waiting for this year to get this approval so that at that point we could announce what our idea was and then find out if it was a good idea or not. Which, just like, let that sink in for a second, and the sort of like mental tricks that plays on you. But that summer, there was another hurdle that was thrown at us, which was that there was an unspoken rule which we learned, which was in order to get approved as a broker-dealer by the regulatory agencies, they wanted us to show them that we had at least 1 year of operating capital on hand before approval, which we calculated was about $1.5 million, and we're like, what? Like, where are we, like, how is this gonna happen? Like, we can't do this. And we had been fundraising for like 4 or 5 months at that point, which we were fundraising for 4 or 5 months.
That's brutal.
It was bad.
So if you're getting like no's and no's and no's and no's, you can still end up $5 billion company. So like, don't be discouraged.
It sucked, yeah.
Or be discouraged, but keep going.
Which is what we did, and there was a point at which we had what we thought was a term sheet from a VC, and we were like about to go out of business. We were just like on the brink of bankruptcy, and we had been for a while. And the term sheet got pulled. and I still remember to this day, it was in Palo Alto, it was like downtown Palo Alto, like kind of near the fire station. I was walking around with Vlad, I was barefoot, because I just walked around barefoot all the time back then. And I remember sitting on this curb next to him and just like looking at him and being like, dude, I think we're about to go out of business. And I was like, it's been an awesome ride, but I think this is the end. And lo and behold, like a week later, we had a fortuitous meeting with Tim Draper, it was a very, very bizarre meeting. We went to his headquarters in San Mateo, and we were pitching him on this idea for free trading, and he was like, oh, well, you know, I backed some entrepreneurs. I think his son might have tried a product like this. He's like, great idea. You know, never gonna get the approval. You guys will never get the approval to do this. And we were like, oh, we're pretty confident that we'll get the approval. And he's like, nah, not gonna happen, but great idea. And he's like, also, how much are you guys paying yourselves? And we're like, excuse me? He's like, yeah, how much are you guys paying yourselves? And we're like, I don't know, like $50,000 a year or something like that? He's like, way too much. And we're like we could barely afford rent at this point. And he's like, great idea, you guys are paying yourselves too much.
And says the guy who like owns like 3 mansions.
Yeah, and we left that meeting and we're like, shit, this is, you know, maybe I don't know what to do. Like we're kind of in this trough of sorrow, and we had the idea. It's like, well, what if we send him an email? And it's like, well, what if we agree not to pay ourselves anything until we get our brokerage license? And we're just like, it's like, I don't know if we can. It's like, I don't know if I can survive like that long. And we decided to do it. We took the bet, and we sent him the email. And a day later, we got an email back from him that he was in. And I ended up like starting to ride my bike into work. Went to Whole Foods and bought a bunch of like bags of rice and beans, and like went into hibernation mode. And it was one of the most creative periods of my life. It was amazing.
When you say like creative, what do you mean? Was it just like walking around barefoot, trying to spend 0 money and like trying to create your way?
I just stopped caring if I failed. And I don't know if I'm doing this period justice, but there was this weight that was lifted off where if this was going to succeed, it was meant to be. And if it wasn't, I had absolutely given every single thing I could to it. And we got our brokerage license. It was about a month and a half late, and it felt like we had done something that was pretty special.
That's really awesome, the idea of like stop caring if you fail. Because I think that so often can really seize people up and cause that like level of paranoia where you don't want to make any decisions because you're worried it might lead you down the wrong path. But like when you have no fucks left to give, like
give it all away.
The world is your oyster.
Literally, give it all away.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated about that because I think so many startups, when they're faced with that period, especially when they don't have like a co-CEO, especially if they're like a sole founder, that's the kind of time when you're like, I'm just going to go hide in my bedroom and sleep until it fails, which can be really savage. And the other thing is that like when you have done everything you can do, there is this like sudden levity, this sense of freedom, because you're like, you know what, like I can't be more responsible than I've already been. I think about this a lot with like health stuff. It's like if you ever have a health scare, it's like you can worry so much about it, but it's like unless you do, like you call every doctor you know, you tap every resource, you do all the research you can to the point where you're like, listen, like I've done everything I can. It's in my doctor's hands at this point, and I just like I'm absolved of the nagging idea that if I did a little bit more, it would have been okay. And I think a lot of startups have a lot of opportunity to learn from that. And so now that you guys have gone, from that end of the spectrum to this like very far other end of the spectrum where you're suddenly like in the spotlight, you're like talking on television, people are throwing these crazy term sheets at you. how do you manage to make sure that like, you don't get in over your head? Because I think a lot of startups, especially if they've had that trouble in the early days when they were really desperate for cash, suddenly they're just like, I'll take all the cash I can get, but you can really get in trouble that way. So how have you guys managed that now on the far end, this place that I know a lot of founders here will hope to get to one day, where you're really deciding how much money you want to take? How do you keep your, not just like the bank accounts right, but how do you keep your head right in that situation?
That's a really good question, and I think there's a part of it that comes from having gone through what we did, where we don't take any of this for granted at all, at any level, and it's evidenced by the fact, by the way that we work. Like Vlad and I are pretty much always the first ones into the office. We're usually some of the last ones out. We have a thing that we do where we get together pretty regularly on the weekends, on Sundays at the office. So Sunday afternoons are Vlad and Baiju time, where like nobody else is around. We sit around and like
a buddy cop movie. It's really cute.
come up with ideas and like talk about physics and like we're friends and we get to spend time together. But we work really long hours, and we work really hard too, because we don't take it for granted. I think one of the things that we've thought about every time we've done this, and I have to say that we've gone through what you're describing, this sort of scary moment of like, we have the opportunity to raise a lot of money. We don't want to set unrealistic expectations for ourselves, because it's not a good look, and it's just not necessary. You know, like if you're raising, as we did at the Series C, we knew we were going to be able to raise over $1 billion. Like, did we really need to push it? Did we really need to optimize every single penny there? Like, what was the point of doing that? And I think every time we've raised a round of funding, we've never taken the highest terms of that. So we kind of try to take, like, kind of the terms that we get, like the second or third highest. And we ask ourselves, like, what would we need to do to realistically live up to this in the most pessimistic of situations? And do we feel comfortable taking that risk? And that's kind of how we frame it.
Yeah, it's kind of about taking as much as you need, but as little as you can get away with.
Yeah.
I think it'd be really valuable.
And I think as we run the company as well, like, we've kept our headcount down quite a bit over the years. Like, today, one of the things that we talk about is that we're about a little under 200 people running a business that is, I think, pretty much across the board bigger than E-Trade now, versus that company which has 3,500 employees. Like, that's what innovation looks like.
Yeah, it's like if you can do the same job or better with a 17th of as many employees, like, you're really building something that matters. So just to summarize some of the awesome insights that Baiju gave us, failures can help you triangulate your future product. Just because something doesn't work doesn't mean there's no value in it. It's about sort of recombinating that, using that as fertilizer for your next project by seeing what worked, what didn't, what do consumers really want. Some people shy away from regulated spaces or spaces that have big technical challenges or science challenges, but that can be your moat when other people can't follow on to you. And while it might be tempting to build as many great features as you can into a product, building one thing and being the best at it and making it so that people love it is really the best way to start building that momentum and traction. And when it comes to hiring, you want to give people challenges. That's why people constantly move jobs, and that's probably why people got into the startup business in the first place, is because they want a challenge. And if you give them that career growth, they'll stick with you like they have with Robinhood. And oftentimes that means unifying behind a big single project and giving people that sense of like being in a war effort, having that morale boost of all being unified rather than all being sort of separated and working on different little projects. And if you level with people about the risks of those projects, they'll really put their heart into it. And then when it comes into building, whether it's a team or just choosing your co-founders, you want co-teachers. You want people you're going to love to learn with for the rest of your startup career. Because you're going to need to change. You're going to need to learn new skills, whether it's just as your industry changes or as your stage and your size changes. There's always going to be something new to figure out. And that often means admitting each other's weaknesses and strengths and letting the other person do what they're great at. It's like about having preferences held weekly. It's like if you be like okay about something and the other person is gung-ho about it, like sometimes it's right to let them just go and take the lead. And when it comes to that really tough time, don't always stiff upper lip it. Like if you do that, you can burn yourself out and go crazy. And there's a lot of opportunity to reach out, whether it's to your co-founders and your team, to your friends, and there's increasingly startup coaches and therapists that really specialize in this stuff for founders in the Valley. And whatever it is, whatever you're doing, just don't give up hope, because sometimes it is the darkest moment that sets you up for the biggest gain. And whatever you do, no matter how big you get, whether it's your first check or the last check before your IPO, just don't take it for granted. Thank you guys for coming and watching. Thank you for being here.
I do have one more thing to say though. As the conference starts to wrap up, we've got one more amazing session and then an awesome cocktail hour and reception. Please go vote, because today is voting day in Silicon Valley, and we really need people to advocate for housing. The Silicon Valley and the tech scene has brought so much demand to housing, and we need more supply. So go check out the YIMBY slate. Yes on Prop D. Vote for London Breed for mayor. They're the people who are going to make sure that Silicon Valley can still be a place for new startups to move. So thank you guys. So please check out and go vote.
Yeah, agreed.